Hey, what's going on, guys? It's BrainBean here again. Today I've got another Ryzen build video for you guys. Now with this one, we're trying to get the most computer that we can for the money and try to keep it somewhere around $1,000. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and see what we can make with $1,000. So the whole concept for this build is to essentially give us the most bang for our buck that we could. Now with GPU prices being still a little bit inflated because of all the mining going on, this was a little bit more tricky than it typically would be given the normal market. But we were still able to get a pretty good system going for a reasonable price. Now we did add a few extras in there. You can see the all-in-one cooler and some RGB strips. I'll point those out. They're not essential to the build, but we wanted to give it a little bit more flair and allow for overclocking later without having to change out the cooler. So to start it off, we're using a Thermaltake Core G21 case. This case is a very affordable tempered glass case, and we wanted to be able to just show off everything in the build while still having a decent frame but not going overboard and spending a ton on the case. So as I mentioned before, we're using the Gigabyte AB350 gaming motherboard. Now this motherboard comes in at around $100, and it's definitely one of the more budget-friendly options for building a system that you want to still have the ability to overclock and have good performance, but isn't going to break the bank. And it does come with a healthy bit of extras that's nice to see on a more budget-friendly motherboard. At $230, the Ryzen 5 1600X processor is going to give us some of the best bang for our buck and also give us the ability to overclock that CPU and try to get it up a little bit higher for more performance. We'll probably do more benchmarking and overclock testing in another video if you guys are interested. And for our memory, we have 16 gigs of Patriot Viper Elite DDR4 at 2400 megahertz. This RAM is going to run you about $140, which is a pretty good price for 16 gigs of DDR4. Of course, you could drop about 30 or 40 extra bucks and get some RGB RAM. Since we're trying to make this more of a bang for the buck build, we're not too worried about the RGB, and because this RAM does have the red accents, it ties in with the motherboard nicely, so it still looks pretty cool. And lastly, before we get the motherboard installed, we're going to go ahead and drop in our Samsung 850 EVO M.2. Now this is a 250 gig M.2 drive for about $106. It's one of the better priced ones out there, and you could say that adding an M.2 into this build is a little bit of an extra expense, but like I said, we're trying to get the best performance for the lowest price. And even though you can't throw a bunch of stuff on this drive, it's still plenty to get the OS on there, and you could throw Steam on there and still have a healthy library of games that are going to boot up ultra quick. And then you can just add like a 2 terabyte hard drive to dump all your other stuff onto later. So now that we've got all that in there on the board, we're going to go ahead and mount it into the case and get it nice and secure. Now at this point in the build is when we start to get into some of the optional components that I mentioned earlier. The first one being the Thermaltake Flow Ring 360 all-in-one cooler. Now we're going to go ahead and get the block installed for that and work on getting that cooler mounted. Now like I mentioned, this is a bit overkill for a build like this, especially if you're going for bang for your buck stuff. This might be a little counterintuitive, but my buddies over at Thermaltake sent one of these over to me to do some testing. So we're going to be using this particular rig to do some overclock testing. We'll do that in a future video. Now, having an all-in-one cooler like this is definitely kind of a luxury. It's something that you don't necessarily need, as you can get away with kind of a smaller air cooler in there. But you can bet that having a big, beefy all-in-one cooler is going to keep that CPU nice and cool and give us some stable overclocks in the future. And yes, the water block is mounted upside down because with this case we had to front mount the radiator and there just wasn't enough slack on those lines to get the block in the right orientation. But since we're probably going to mod this case anyways, it's not a big deal because we're going to probably put some kind of acrylic plate over it, so it really wasn't that much of an issue. After swapping out a couple of fans to match the premium Ring 12s on the radiator, we moved on to some preliminary cable management. Of course, this is the least fun part of any build and you can spend as much time on it as you want, but we wanted to get all that done before we dropped in the power supply and then did the rest of the cable management from there. For the power supply, we're using a Thermaltake Smart Pro RGB 750 watt fully modular power supply. Now for about $82, this is going to give us all of the cable customization options that we need, and it'll also be plenty to power the current system as well as give us room to grow in the future. One of the last things we added was some RGB light strips. Now you could argue again that this is something you don't necessarily need, and for going bang for the buck, yeah, you don't really need to go with aesthetics as much, it's all about the performance. But in my opinion, if you're going to be using a nice tempered glass case and you're joining the PC master race, we like to show things off. So one thing I like to do is use a power supply jumper, and that allows us to light up all of the lights before we install them into the case, and then we could get the best positioning and kind of know how things are going to look before we fire everything up and use the adhesive on the strips and all that. It's not as final, so you get to kind of play around with it a little bit. And last but certainly not least is the graphics card. Now, as most of you guys know, with the way the market is right now, GPUs are wildly inflated, especially the 1060s and 1070s. So we decided to go with the Aorus GTX 1066GB. Now we did this because it's one of the very best bang for your buck cards as far as frame rates per dollar spent. Now this graphics card has a 3D Mark score of 12,780, which is pretty darn good considering it only costs about 320 bucks. Now you can get different varieties of this card for about anywhere from $250 up, but again, a lot of that's largely going to depend on how the market is at the time you're looking to purchase your graphics card. Now with the build complete, let's go ahead and just take a look at the price breakdown for the components. Now here you can see everything totaled out to about 1,050 bucks. Now you can probably find some sales here or there depending on where you're shopping, as well as the way that GPU market is going to be looking for you. Now with all that in mind, we benchmarked this PC at 1080p because that's what we're going to be using it for. And also, if you're going to be doing a budget build like this, chances are you're not going to be using a higher end $500 plus 1440 monitor. So with that in mind, at 1080p, this is what we got in terms of benchmarks. Now, all these tests are going to be at max settings. So for CSGO, we got 160 frames on average. Overwatch, we were averaging about 98 frames per second. Tomb Raider, 61 frames. Witcher 3, 57 frames. And Battlefield 1, 73 frames. So overall, I'm really happy with the performance we were able to get out of this PC for the money that we spent. And also, I think we did a good job about coordinating the colors of the hardware in the build as well, just to kind of tie everything together. Of course, those optional extras as well really kind of help the build pop and set it off and show off all the components inside. And we're also going to be doing some modding to this case and really customize the build a little bit, make it look a little bit flashier, so you guys can keep a lookout for that in the future. But for now, I think we did what we set out to do, which was create a more affordable PC that was still going to give us a lot of performance. Well, that's it for the build video, guys. Let me know in those comments down below what you think about what we were able to build for about $1,000. You can also leave me suggestions as to other types of builds you want to see from me in the future. You know, you saw that fully customized Soldier 76 build that I did, as well as this Ryzen build. And I think next I'm going to try to do an ultra budget build and try to keep it somewhere around 500, maybe even 400 bucks. Consider giving this video a like if you enjoyed it to show your support, and if you're new here and you want to see more content from me, you can click that subscribe button because I've got a lot more coming for you in the near future. If you'd like to build a computer like this for yourself, of course I have all the links to everything that we use down in the description below. That's it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.